Now, starting from the design and build, the Realme 6 Pro had a slightly thicker form factor due to its physical fingerprint sensor at the side, which unlocks in 0.38 seconds compared to the in-display fingerprint sensor which the Samsung Galaxy A71 has. And the Realme 6 Pro had a nice unique finish at the back with a very interesting lightning-inspired design, where the Samsung Galaxy A71 had a more minimalist geometric designs with a tiny little light shift when the phone is tilted against the light. Now, in terms of the placements of the buttons, as mentioned on the right, you'll find not only the power button but of course integrated together with the side fingerprint sensor. Then on the Samsung Galaxy A71, you have the volume rocker and also the power button on the right. Then you find both of the SIM card and the microSD card slot on the left, where both can support up to either 2 SIMs or a single SIM with a microSD card slot over there, where on the left side you'll find the volume rockers on the Realme 6 Pro. Then looking down below, it is the same for both, where both has the headphones jack. Yes, long live headphones jack. Then there's the usual USB-C port, and also both phones has the speaker grill down there as well. So while there's no IP rating for both phones, but the Realme 6 Pro has a 3 waterproof layer to prevent water from invading through the earphones hole, the USB interface, and all the SIM card slots, the battery cover, and the other components connectors as well. So that is a plus feature on the Realme 6 Pro. Now, as for the phone's display, the Realme 6 Pro comes with a 6.6-inch IPS LCD display, and the Samsung Galaxy A71 comes with a slightly bigger 6.7-inch Super AMOLED screen with the same resolution on both phones at 1080 by 2400 pixels. Now, in terms of the technology of the panels of the screen, Samsung has always known to produce very good screens, but when you put the phone side by side, in terms of the sharpness and details, both are the same, where the only difference that you would see is definitely when it comes to the color reproduction. The Samsung Galaxy A71 had a more saturated image instead of a more natural look on the Realme 6 Pro. Now, for me, I kinda like the colors coming out from the Samsung Galaxy A71, but surely this comes down to a personal preference. By default, there is a cooler color temperature on the Realme 6 Pro, which can be adjusted to your liking. However, where I was really shocked is the fact that the Realme 6 Pro had a 90Hz ultra smooth display refresh rate, which no other smartphones right now within this range has, which is surely a plus feature to give a nicer and a smoother navigation compared to the Samsung Galaxy A71. Now, as for the phone's camera, the Realme 6 Pro has a 64MP f1.8 main lens, a 12MP f2.5 aperture telephoto lens, an 8MP f2.3 13mm ultra-wide angle lens, and a 2MP f2.4 dedicated macro lens. Then the Samsung Galaxy A71 comes with also a 64MP f1.8 aperture, a 12MP f2.2 12mm ultra-wide angle lens, a 5MP f2.4 macro lens, and a 5MP f2.2 depth sensor. So if you're taking shots in the 64MP mode, you'll find that the images does look the same, since it had the same aperture value other than the same megapixel count, of course. Where the only difference is the color of the sky, where in real time, where the Realme 6 Pro had a more color accurate image, where the image processing for the A71 was just tiny bit saturated. Then looking at the regular shots, I find that both pictures looks identical, where it had great dynamic range with the overall great image processing on both the regular photo mode, but as seen in this image, sometimes the main lens does struggle on the shadows for the A71 if you guys look at the trees towards the right side of the image. Now, since there is a dedicated telephoto lens on the Realme 6 Pro, you will have a more versatile lens options which can go up to 20 times hybrid zoom, but I would just recommend using the zoom up to 5 times since it does have a dedicated telephoto lens. Now, like the main lens, the ultra-wide lens looks the same, but since the focal length of the A71 is a bit wider, you will come across a slightly distorted edges as seen in this bar rail over here towards the bottom left of the image and the edge of the pillar over on the top left of the screen. As for the portrait mode, due to the current social distancing reasons, I couldn't take pictures of people, but I took images of objects instead, where here's where I find that the Realme 6 Pro performed better in getting the right object in focus compared to the A71, which will work better on humans more, as he had troubles trying to focus on the subject, but when the objects has better texture, that's where the A71 could finally capture some great portrait mode shots as well. Then as for the macro shots, since the Samsung Galaxy A71 had a bigger sensor, there were more details in the shot, especially when you get the focus right. But I did find troubles trying to nail the shots easily, where some of the shots had issues trying to focus, so it can be a hit or miss, but I find it easier to take macro shots on the Realme 6 Pro. Looking at the night shots, here's where the Realme 6 Pro gets the edge here with a Super Nightscape 3.0 with no noise at the darker areas as opposed to the A71 as seen in this image when using the ultra-wide shots. But the night shots looks better on the A71 on the main lens instead, but the Realme 6 Pro gets a better color reproduction as seen over here. Then there's also a unique mode called tripod mode at this night mode to get a super long exposure shot to receive more details at night. But in this mode, you'll need to make sure that the phone is stable to get the best results. Then as for the front camera, the Realme 6 Pro has not one but two cameras in front. One is a 16 megapixel f2.1 wide lens and the other is an 8 megapixel f2.2 ultra wide lens which covers a 105-degree angle. Then the Samsung Galaxy A71 has only a single lens of a 32 megapixel f2.2 wide lens. Now looking at the regular selfie shots, the images on the A71 look sharper due to its higher megapixel sensor, but I prefer how the skin tones is a bit less harsher on the Realme 6 Pro in this image, especially on the colors of my eyes is a bit brighter on the Realme 6 Pro. Then switching to the portrait selfie on the Realme 6 Pro and the live focus on the A71, you notice a better background dynamic range on the A71 like in this shot where you can still see the skies even though the background is blurred out, where it is overexposed on the Realme 6 Pro. But the edge detection is very consistent on the Realme 6 Pro, and this could be because of the secondary lens which could have acted as a better lens sensor to separate the subject from the background, where in this image you'll see the top of my hair on the A71 is blended to the background compared to a better edge detection on the Realme 6 Pro. Now as mentioned, there is a dedicated lens to take some wider selfie on the Realme 6 Pro, where in this mode on the A71 it just takes a slightly wider shot due to its software processing, but you won't get as much of a wider angle on the Realme 6 Pro. Then as for the video taking capabilities, both phones records up to UHD 4K 2160 up to 30 frames per second. But as you guys can see that in this UHD 4K mode, the Realme 6 Pro is way more stable thanks to its UIS video stabilization compared to the Samsung Galaxy A71. Then both phones has their own steady mode or the stable mode which records up to a maximum of 1080p instead, where comparing both, there was this weird image warping as seen on the floor lines on the A71 down below, but the video footage overall was better on the stabilization for the A71 in this mode. Then as for the front video camera, the Realme 6 Pro records up to 1080p at 30 frames per second, but the Samsung Galaxy A71 records up to UHD 4K 2160 instead, but the image stabilization is not great at all, but it's way better at 1080p, and I like the overall image for the Samsung Galaxy A71.